What's up, everybody? Thought I'd share a thought about worship that I had recently. This has happened to me for quite a long time in worship, and it wasn't until recently that I figured out what I think this means. Maybe you can relate to this experience. So, I'll be in the worship service with God's people on the Lord's Day, and we'll be either reading scripture or reciting the liturgy, which is mostly scripture in our church, or perhaps singing a praise song or a hymn. And all of a sudden, almost like for the first time in the worship service, I will experience a wave of what I might call true worship, where my heart is inclined to the things of the Lord, that I'm drawn to His glory and His beauty, and my heart is truly refreshed and thankful to be there. And maybe this is only one moment in the whole worship service, or two or five. It's almost like through much of the worship service, my body was going through the motions, and I was singing the songs and reading the liturgy and following along in the hymnal. But I would have this all of a sudden quite unexpected awareness of the presence of God, and just a thankfulness and a true joy and gratitude would rush into my heart. And sometimes it would only last for a moment or two. And here's the big realization that I cannot believe I've never thought about this before. Whenever that wave of true worship, that fresh air of, yes, I'm really worshiping Him now, I'm thankful to be in His presence, whenever that used to come over me, my first thought was always shame that I didn't have that feeling throughout the earlier part of the service, or throughout the rest of the service, or that I couldn't sustain it for longer than a moment or two, or a glimpse, or a couple of minutes, or the thought of a particular verse. And it would always be shame. Matt, why can't you worship like this the whole time? Why is your heart so hard that you weren't thinking these thoughts of joy before? Where was your mind? Were you being selfish, or were you being materialistic, or were you being a man conscious of those people's opinions around me? And I would almost always shame myself and immediately discard that feeling of joy and replace it with a feeling of shame that I hadn't achieved this level of worship, or this moment of a glimpse of glory earlier, and that I couldn't sustain it. So it almost always came across me as almost like a moment of conviction that I wasn't a good or true enough worshiper. And recently, the aha moment that has struck me so powerfully is, instead of being ashamed of myself that I can't sustain these feelings, or that I hadn't felt it before in the service, instead I'm really trying to focus on gratitude, that in that moment the Lord has swept me up into His presence. And so I'm replacing in my outlook of worship this self-chastisement for not being a true worshiper earlier, for a sense of relief and thankfulness and gratitude that God has come upon me afresh once again in the worship service. And I realize this happens to me almost every worship service, that at least one time there's a moment where God, as it were, sweeps me up, or lifts me up, or holds me in His arms and makes His presence known to me. And the truth is that this is a mysterious thing, and I can't explain it. I don't understand why it happens at a certain moment in the service or another moment later. Most of the time, as of recently, it's been during the liturgy, the reading of Scripture, during perhaps the call to worship or the prayer of confession. In our worship service, we have a ton of Scripture interlaced throughout the whole service. Almost nothing is done without a reading of Scripture. Not even the offering is taken without a reading of Scripture. And very often it'll be a word on a page, the word grace, or the word joy, or the word eternal, or the word holy. And I would sense God's presence come over me, almost like when you're outside on a beautiful day, and the wind all of a sudden just sweeps up and cools you, and you're immediately aware of your presence and thankful that you are where you are. It's like that for me in worship. And instead of shaming myself that I can't muster up the strength, or I can't conjure up that feeling or sustain that feeling for long, instead, recently I'm focusing on just gratitude that once again God has met with me in his church, with his people, and in his word. Well, I'd like to know if you experienced the same thing or a similar phenomenon. Maybe you've experienced similar trials with guilt or self-chastisement even as you're worshiping. That is why the confession of sin and the receiving of what we call the assurance of pardon is such an important part of the worship service. And we do it early so that we can be made ready then for God's presence to overwhelm us with his joy and thankfulness. Love to know what you think, what you experienced during worship. Feel free to comment in the comment section below. Like, subscribe, doesn't matter to me. It's all up to you. Did want to mention again that my new book, Unknown, The Extraordinary Influence of Ordinary Christians, is now available on Amazon, and its official drop, as it were, is this Thanksgiving, so feel free to check that out. Well, thanks again. Love to hear your thoughts on worship, particularly related to things I've mentioned. Love you lots. Check you later.